With TVR seemingly coming back and going away again every other weekend, it must be kind of awkward, I would imagine, to work out the licensing agreements with a brand like TVR. I guess for older models it might be a bit easier because it's more of a legacy thing, but for newer stuff such as the newer shape Griffith, which we're still waiting for and probably always will be, which has featured in Forza, I mean that's got to be a pain to have stuff like that licensed into a game. In the case of GT7 we do of course have the Tuscan, and that's about it for now, but Gran Turismo has virtually always had a very strong history of TVRs. The Tuscan, the Speed 12, the Chimaera in the earlier games, and then stuff like the Cerberus, the Tamora, the T350, which would kind of come and go here and there in different games along the way. And even though there have been some notable TVR omissions over the years, which we've still never had, like the Sagaris, or maybe an old school Tuscan, or an old Gran Tura, or a Vixen, maybe even one of the Wedge models. And for me personally, I would love to see a Tuscan R, or a Typhon, perhaps even a T440R featuring Gran Turismo. For now though, we only have the Tuscan to work with. So for this particular look back into GT6's vault, if you will, for the vehicles which I do think have a pretty good chance of coming back, this one is probably the next most obvious choice if they were going to bring another TVR back, because even though they don't always go for cars which were already premiums, you've got to think that that would be at least an advantage from a modelling and from a development point of view, because they clearly already like the car enough to do that to it in the past. And in the case of the Tamora, well, it's a car which wasn't as beloved by many people, not even as talked about generally speaking as your Cerberus and Tuscans, certainly not something like a Speed 12, but I've always liked the Tamora. It's kind of a cuter looking, almost softer, more approachable version of a TVR, and after having spoken a while back now, years ago at this point, to a TVR specialist, he actually confirmed to me that the Tamora is one of the easier TVRs to get behind the wheel of, with a 3.6 litre engine, of course still front engine, rear wheel drive, manual box, none of the accoutrement which you'd expect from any kind of civilised car, because TVRs are anything but civilised generally speaking. It's still a 345 horsepower machine which weighs barely over a tonne, 1,060 kilos, and if I recall correctly, back in GT6 you could drop the weight on this thing a lot. I think it was something like 880 kilos, I want to say 886 fully built, which is crazy lightweight for a sports car. So even if you don't upgrade the power at all, that's immediately a monster. And even in terms of price tag, well, TVRs have always been pretty good for that. In fact, you could say they're one of the relatively few European brands in Gran Turismo which doesn't get overinflated prices. Jaguars, Mercedes models, Aston Martins, various other Euro brands, or more specifically British ones on occasion, do tend to be pretty inflated on price. Astons, for example, tend to be a couple of $100,000 minimum, with the very rare exception generally in the newer games, but TVRs, they've never been crazy expensive. Even something as OP as the Speed 12, it's a $250,000, which really isn't that crazy for a supercar. In the case of this one, just over $70,000 is certainly not breaking the bank, and if you were to bring that back now, well, that's a prime rival, a prime alternative for your Corvettes and GTRs and Audi R8s and various other things, and of course with that more raw approach and that natural huge advantage in terms of both weight and its smaller physical size, well, much like a Lotus, speaking of licensing issues, or even others too like Marcos, which itself has had a bit of a patchy history when it comes to being included in Gran Turismo or not, there's so much potential to work with when it comes to something like a Tamora. Of course it's overshadowed by most, if not all, of the other vehicles, but I do find it curious that they chose to make this one a premium when there were some more obvious choices, arguably, to do that with instead. Why didn't they, for example, make the Cerberus Speed 6 a full premium? Why not the Speed 12? I mean, with the Speed 12 you could kind of understand it, finding a car to model wouldn't have been the easiest thing in the world, given that there's only like one of them, and certainly would have been back in the day. This one though, well, clearly they liked it well enough to make it a full premium, so I think that alone is what makes me think it has a chance, but in terms of the grand scheme of things, I don't know how much of a chance a car like this would have, because for many players, yes, it would be a nice new addition, certainly for us fellow TVR fans, but I feel like everything this car can mostly give you, so can the Tuscan. So although it would be nice to have it, it doesn't necessarily fill any kind of void which the Tuscan doesn't already do. I would probably say it should be one of three. The Sagaris would be a fairly obvious choice, more in the supercar kind of sphere. Of course the Speed 12 would be the ultimate choice for many of us, myself included, but potentially a good other option, and it would fit quite nicely potentially into a maybe Group 3. It might be kind of borderline Group 3, Group 4, but something like a T400 or a T440R with a DeWalt livery. It's a pretty iconic race car from TVR's modern age. It's always fun to talk about TVRs. I think, as I said, it has a chance, but I wouldn't say necessarily as good of a chance as some others. We'll have to ultimately wait and see if it ever does return, and being a premium, that's got to count for something already. Maybe not much, but something. So I'll see you next time, of course, with more revisited cars cars from GT6, which I think have a chance of coming back, maybe in a GT7 update, or perhaps even in the next game, but we'll have to wait and see. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.